Welcome to our deep dive, and today we're tackling a giant, Jean-Paul Sartre, using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our guide. Since you're a philosopher, we can skip the intro stuff and get right into the good stuff. We're talking bad faith, look, all that jazz.
Yeah, Sartre, he wasn't just some dusty academic. He was a public intellectual, like a modern-day Voltaire, you could say.
Huge crowds at his lectures.
Yeah.
Not a lot of philosophers today have that kind of rock star status. I mean, he wrote novels, plays, he was involved in politics.
And his work with Simone de Beauvoir, their journal, Les Temps Modernes, was so important in post-war France. I think it's true that academia has moved on a bit from Sartre, what with all the post-structuralism and everything, but there's still so much in his work that speaks to us, especially, I think, for a philosopher like yourself.
Absolutely, and that's what we're going to dig into. Let's start with one of his most famous ideas, intentionality. It all began with an apricot cocktail, apparently.
Oh, it's a great story. So picture young Sartre in a Parisian cafe listening to a friend describe this elaborate apricot cocktail, and bam, he has this epiphany about intentionality, the idea that consciousness is always directed outward towards something. It's not just this internal world.
So it's not about us just navel-gazing, it's about how we engage with the world.
Exactly. And this was a huge shift from those classic debates about idealism and realism. For Sartre, consciousness is always consciousness of something. That ofness is key.
I see how that breaks us out of those old boxes. Instead of being trapped in our own heads, we're thrown into the world, interacting with objects, other people, ideas. And it makes me think about how this outward focus might connect to Sartre's ideas about the self.
Absolutely. This leads right into his early work, Transcendence of the Ego.
Yeah, the title itself is pretty provocative. What's he getting at with this transcendent ego?
He's challenging that traditional idea of a static, pre-existing self. He argues that the ego isn't this inner control center, but a product of reflection on experience, not the source of it.
So it's not like there's this little me inside calling the shots. The ego is something that emerges as we engage with the world.
Exactly. He uses this great example, chasing a streetcar. In that moment, you're totally absorbed in the act. The I kind of disappears. You're not thinking, oh, I'm chasing this streetcar. You're just in it, the act itself.
I get that those moments when you're so focused on something, you lose track of self-awareness, just pure action. But how does a transcendent ego, something that comes after the fact, relate to consciousness always being intentional, always outward?
Because for Sartre, consciousness is fundamentally impersonal. It's not tied to a fixed ego. It's constantly reaching beyond itself, engaging with the world.
So the ego is more like a story we tell ourselves about our experiences, not the driver of those experiences. This idea of impersonal consciousness is really fascinating.
And this leads us to another key part of Sartre's thinking, imagination.
Imagination. Okay, I'm intrigued. It seems like a jump from intentionality in the ego, but I'm with you.
It's all connected to his view of freedom, especially in art and literature. In his book, The Imaginary, Sartre argues that imagination lets us escape the real and create new worlds.
So we're talking daydreaming, getting lost in a good book.
In a way, yes. For Sartre, imagination is an act of creation, transcending limits. He says a novel, for example, doesn't just mirror reality, it creates an analogon, its own world, its own logic, and the reader, they're drawn into that.
So instead of passively reflecting the world, the novel actively generates a new one, and the reader becomes part of that creation by reading.
Exactly. And this connects back to his own novel, Nausea, where he explores the absurdity of existence, the idea that the world is ultimately contingent. It's through consciousness, that freedom to imagine, that we give meaning to this absurd reality.
And this is where his existentialism comes into play, right?
Yeah.
We're not just passive observers, but active participants in creating meaning. But the world being contingent without inherent meaning. That's a tough one. How do we even begin to unpack that?
Well, that takes us to Sartre's most famous work, Being and Nothingness.
Being and nothingness. Kind of the Mount Everest of existentialist texts. What makes it so essential, especially for a philosopher?
It lays out his whole philosophical framework. A good place to start is his distinction between being in itself and being for itself.
Okay, let's break that down. Being in itself, being for itself. What are we talking about here?
So being in itself, that's the realm of things, objects. They just exist. No consciousness, no freedom. Think of a rock, a tree. They just are.
No existential crises for them.
Exactly. Now, being for itself, that's consciousness. It's defined by its ability to negate, to question, to imagine, and ultimately to choose. This is where freedom comes in.
So unlike those rocks and trees, We're not just stuck being what we are. We can transcend our current state.
Exactly. And this is where Sartre's idea of nothingness becomes so important. It's not emptiness, but the ability of consciousness to grasp what is not.
Wait, hold on. Nothingness
Yeah.
as a foundation for possibility? That's a lot, even for a philosopher. Got an example for us?
Think of Pierre's absence from the cafe. He's not physically there, but that absence is still a presence. The cafe is kind of haunted by his not being there, by the nothingness that his absence creates.
Like when you're waiting for someone and they're late, that not being there, you can almost feel it. So this nothingness, it's not just an empty void, it shapes our experience.
Exactly. And for Sartre, this ability to grasp what is not is the basis of our freedom. It allows us to imagine other possibilities, to choose a different path. We're not defined by some preset essence.
Which brings us to his famous phrase, existence precedes essence, right? We create ourselves through our choices, our engagement with the world, and this nothingness makes it possible.
Exactly. We're always transcending who we are, projecting ourselves into the future, becoming who we choose to be through our actions.
But that raises a question for me. If we're always becoming, what makes us act in the first place? How does action fit in with this whole nothingness and freedom thing?
Sartre says action comes from lack, what he calls a négatité. We perceive something missing, something we want, and we act to fill that void.
So it's a striving to become more, to move beyond limits, to fill that nothingness we experience.
Exactly. A fundamental desire to transcend our current state. Our projects, our goals, they all come from this sense of lack.
I'm starting to see how even our limitations can be a source of freedom, a push to act. It makes me think about those times when we try to deny our freedom to avoid that feeling of lack. Isn't that where bad faith comes in?
You're right. That's a perfect way to bring up bad faith. One of Sartre's most, I think, insightful concepts and still so relevant today. Trying to run away from the anxiety that comes with being free, that responsibility for our choices,
Trying to fool ourselves into thinking we're not really free so we don't have to face the consequences, huh?
Exactly. It's self-deception. Sartre, he really takes Freud to task on this. He says Freud splits the subject up, the censor who both knows and doesn't know the repressed truth.
Okay, so if it's not about the unconscious, how does Sartre explain bad faith then?
For Sartre, it's a choice, a conscious one, even if we're not fully aware of it. We try to shrink ourselves down into some fixed role, some identity, to get out of dealing with freedom. We pretend to be what we're not.
His waiter example, right?
Oh, the waiter, classic example. He gets so into playing the part of waiter that he forgets he has a choice, forgets his own humanity even.
Becomes an object, just a cafe waiter, not a person.
Oh.
I've met people like that. It's a little creepy.
It is. It's this subtle, but it's everywhere. This inauthenticity, all these temptations around us to just deny our freedom, to fit in.
As a philosopher, it makes me think about the ethics of it all. If we're always tempted to duck responsibility, how can we even hold ourselves accountable, let alone others?
That's the big question Sartre throws at us. No easy answers there. He doesn't give us a step-by-step guide to being authentic, We're always struggling with this freedom and responsibility in a world that wants us to conform.
Which brings us to the look, right? And all that stuff about intersubjectivity. How do we deal with other people when we're all trying to figure out our own freedom and authenticity and all that?
Look, that's one of Sartre's most powerful ideas, and maybe the most disturbing. He builds on Hegel, Husserl, but takes it in a whole new direction. Remember the keyhole example?
Oh, yeah, kind of creepy, but it really gets at how someone else's presence can just totally change how we see ourselves.
You're looking through a keyhole, right? Totally engrossed. You're the subject, the one in control. Then you hear footsteps.
The other arrives.
Exactly. And suddenly, you're not the subject anymore. You're the object, the one being looked at. It's this feeling of shame, of being caught out, reduced to just what the other sees.
And it's not just empathy, trying to read their mind. It's that experience of being seen, objectified.
Exactly. Look, it changes us, whether we want it to or not. Makes us realize we exist not just for ourselves, but for others too.
It makes you think how we try to control how others see us all the time, As a philosopher, it raises so many questions about relationships, this whole subject-object thing.
And it forces us to get out of our own heads, to acknowledge the impact others have on us. There's no escaping it, this intersubjectivity.
All this talk about freedom, bad faith,
Mm-hmm.
that makes me think about the choices we make, our projects in life, all that. Didn't Sartre develop his own kind of psychoanalysis to get at those motivations?
He did. In his later work, he develops what he calls existential psychoanalysis.
Now, I know Sartre wasn't exactly Freud's biggest fan, so how does his version differ?
Well, he throws out the unconscious. He focuses on what he calls the individual's fundamental project, freely chosen. It's the aim that guides our actions, our choices, our whole lives, really.
So not about digging up childhood trauma, but understanding the choices we make consciously that shape our path. Like some grand plan we might not even be aware of.
Right. He says this project, it's chosen but not always known. It's there. Under the surface, you have to interpret it.
Like we're writing our own stories, even if we're not always aware of the plot.
That's a good way to put it. And Sartre thinks you can decipher this project by looking closely at our choices, our relationships, even our art.
So he's using this to understand people's lives, their art, like his work on Baudelaire, Flaubert.
Exactly. He digs into their lives, their work, to uncover these fundamental projects. With Baudelaire, for example, he sees this project of rebelling against society, seeking this aesthetic transcendence.
So even our rebellions, they can be part of a bigger project, a way of making sense of things. This fundamental project idea, it's fascinating. And it's not just about individuals, is it? It makes you think about social movements, politics.
Which leads me to another interesting part of Sartre's work, his attempt to connect existentialism and Marxism.
Now that's where things get really interesting, especially for a philosopher. On the surface, they seem totally opposed, right? Existentialism all about individual freedom and Marxism focusing on these social structures, economic determinism. How do you even bring those together?
It seems impossible. Sartre tackles it head-on in the critique of dialectical reason. He wants to account for both individual freedom and the influence of society.
So he's not ditching Marxism completely.
Yeah, no. He sees its value for understanding history, social dynamics, but he rejects those deterministic readings, the ones that say we're just products of our economic class.
Pushing back against that idea that we're just puppets, no agency.
Absolutely. He insists we always have a choice, even within those structures.
But if we have a choice, how does he explain the very real limitations those structures impose? How do you reconcile freedom with all that weight?
This is where he introduces the practico-inert. These are the solidified structures, institutions, norms, ways of doing things that become obstacles to our freedom.
The dead weight of history, you could say. Those patterns that are so hard to break.
Exactly. And he sees this practico-inert as a form of alienation, separating us from our true selves from each other.
So we're surrounded by these structures, this practico-inert, limiting us. Does Sartre give us any hope of escaping this? Or are we just stuck?
He does offer hope, but it's not a simple fix. He talks about the group infusion, these moments of collective action, solidarity, where people transcend that alienation and experience real freedom together.
Can you give us an example of what that might look like, a group infusion?
He uses the example of workers fleeing during the French Revolution. At some point, they stop running, turn, and face their oppressors together.
Like a spontaneous uprising. Individual fear melts away, and this new power emerges.
Yes. But Sartre's also a realist. He says these moments, they're fleeting. They face what he calls an ontological check.
An ontological check, meaning what, the group always falls apart?
He thinks they almost always run up against limitations, institutions.
So even revolutions, they end up becoming part of the establishment, that practico-inert they were fighting against. Kind of a depressing thought.
It's a pattern, for sure. But Sartre is not saying we should despair. He thinks that by understanding these dynamics, we can still make choices, resist. We can keep striving for that authentic freedom.
This is also thought-provoking, especially when you think about how to create change, socially, politically. And it connects directly to Sartre's own activism, right? Especially his anti-colonialism.
Absolutely. Sartre didn't just write about this stuff, he lived it.
He put his philosophy into action. So for him, things like colonialism, racism, those are prime examples of bad faith, creating these false categories, denying people's freedom and dignity.
Precisely. He saw them as violence, denying that fundamental freedom we all share.
His book, Anti-Semite and Jew, it's such a powerful critique of these systems. How does he analyze prejudice, discrimination in that work?
It's a brilliant analysis of how prejudice creates this self-fulfilling prophecy of bad faith. He argues those in power use these categories to define others, to limit them. And it's not just the active racists who are complicit.
He's talking about passive complicity, too.
Exactly. Even if you're not actively racist, you can still contribute to the problem by staying silent, not challenging the structures.
So it's not enough to just not be racist. You have to actively dismantle the system.
That's Sartre's argument. He calls for a radical transformation, a movement towards justice, equality, where everyone has the chance to live freely, authentically.
You can see how his existentialism, his political commitments, they're all connected. He wasn't just concerned with abstract ideas, he wanted to apply them to real-world problems.
It's all one piece, whether it's philosophy, plays, political essays, it's all driven by that belief in freedom and the responsibility that goes with it.
This deep dive has been quite a journey. We've covered so much: his early days with phenomenology, existential psychoanalysis later on, his complicated relationship with Marxism, his own creative work, and it all ties together this commitment to freedom and authenticity.
And we've just scratched the surface. There's so much more to discover in Sartre.
Even with this glimpse, it's been so insightful. What do you think are the key takeaways, especially for someone who's really into philosophy, like our listener?
Sartre, I think he throws down a challenge to all of us, especially people who like to think about these things. He's saying, face your freedom, own your choices, and get involved in making a better world.
He doesn't give us easy answers.
No,
Yeah.
no simple solutions, no comforting lies. But that's what makes him so important. He makes us deal with the messy reality of being human, finding our own way when there's no inherent meaning.
So even if Sartre didn't have all the answers, he gives us the tools to ask the right questions, to really think about our lives, the world.
Exactly. His philosophy is a call to action. It's about embracing our freedom and using it to make a difference.
We've been really digging into Sartre's philosophy and his politics, but we can't forget about his own creative side, right? I mean, the guy was a writer, a playwright.
Oh, totally. His own work, it's all connected to his philosophy. Like Nausea, for example. It's not just a novel. It's like this deep dive into existentialism.
That scene with the chestnut tree, man, it just grabs you, that feeling of absurdity, the world just existing, no meaning, just being.
And his plays are so powerful, too. No exit. Hell is other people, right? It's brilliant how he shows how relationships can trap us in bad faith.
So for Sartre, art, especially literature, it wasn't just about pretty words. It was a way to grapple with these big ideas:
Right.
freedom, responsibility, what it means to be human.
For sure. He thought literature had a real social and political role to play. Writers, they should be challenging injustice, waking people up to their freedom.
So not art for art's sake, but art as a tool for change.
He saw writers as revolutionaries, shaking things up, making us imagine something better.
And he didn't just talk about it, he lived it. His essays on literature, they're so passionate about this idea of writers being committed to justice.
His essay, What is Literature? It's essential reading for anyone who wants to understand his view on art and politics. He says writers have a duty to use their words to fight oppression, to show the human condition in all its complexity.
It all comes back to that core belief, freedom, and the responsibility that comes with it. It seems like everything Sartre did, writing philosophy, plays, political stuff, it was all driven by that.
His work, it's all one piece, really, driven by that commitment to freedom and authenticity.
This deep dive has been so enriching. We've covered a ton, from those early days with phenomenology to existential psychoanalysis later on, his back and forth with Marxism, even his own artistic creations. And it all fits together, this really powerful and challenging way of seeing the world.
And we've barely scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore in Sartre.
But even with this glimpse, it's been really insightful. What do you think of the big takeaways, especially for someone who's really into philosophy, like our listener?
I think Sartre, he really lays down a challenge, especially for people who think deeply about these things. He's saying, look, confront your freedom, own your choices, and get out there and make the world better.
No easy answers with Sartre.
Nope. No simple solutions, no sugarcoating. But that's what makes him so valuable. He makes us grapple with what it means to be human, to find our own way when there's no preset path.
So even if Sartre didn't have all the answers, he gives us the tools to ask the right questions, to think critically about our own lives and the world we live in.
Exactly. His philosophy, it's not about sitting back and thinking. It's about getting out there and doing something. It's about taking that freedom and using it to make a difference.
Well, this deep dive has given us a lot to chew on. I hope our listener will keep digging into Sartre's work, wrestling with those ideas, and finding ways to apply them to their own life and their own philosophical journey. It's been a pleasure exploring Sartre with you.
Likewise, always a good time to dive into Sartre.